Welcome to Durga Analytics. So this video is part of our extended ETRM 500 chapter training series, and this is section 8 we are focusing on, which is credit, collateral and margining, and that covers 276 chapter to 320 chapters. So this chapter is more focused on credit, collateral and margining strategies in ETRM, or if you are working on Endur or any other ETRM platform. So the concept is same, and the guide is a comprehensive guide to chapter 276 to 320. So this will help you to understand high level overview and the real concept behind these chapters, right? So let's start with concept of financial crisis and why it happens. So every financial crisis begins with a promise that was not kept, right? So you start with a promise and it is not kept, right? So that's what the financial crisis happened, right? Now you can have perfect pricing model, you can have perfect sophisticated risk curve and highly profitable trades, but if your counterparty fails, none of that matters, right? So profits on paper don't pay real losses, right? So in this section we are stepping into the world of counterparty credit risk, the risk that party on the other side of your trade cannot or will not pay, right? And we are not learning this theoretically, we'll follow a realistic operating scenario. So we are taking a hypothetical example of Aurora Commodities. It's a company. So Aurora is an energy trading firm operating in volatile gas markets, dealing with fluctuating prices, multiple legal entities and counterparty spread across regions. So their survival depends on one thing: making sure exposure never runs ahead of protection, right? This is where ETRM or systems like Endur becomes critical, right? It's not a trading system, it's a control system, right? A system that continuously answers three dangerous questions: how much we are exposed right now, what protection do we already hold, and how fast can market move against us before we react, right? So in this section we'll learn how ETRM or Endur calculates real-time exposure, enforce credit limits, applied netting rules, tracks collateral, and triggers margin calls, and produces regulatory ready reporting. Everything should be done automatically, continuously, and all before losses become disasters, right? So that is the purpose. So think of this section as a seat belt, airbags and braking system of trading operations, right? You hope you never need them, but if you do, they decide whether your firm survive, right? So by end of this section, you will not just understand what credit risk is, you will understand how professionals control it, right? How ETRM like Endur or Allegro enforce it, and why every real trading firm live or dies by these mechanisms, right? So let's begin. We'll move to slide 2. So let's start with a simple situation. Imagine you are hosting a house party. People arrive, music is playing, drinks are flowing, food is served freely, right? Everyone looks happy, everyone is enjoying themselves. But here is the uncomfortable truth. If guests leave without setting the bill, you are the one paying for it, right? So this is exactly how credit risk works in trading, right? So trades feel smooth, market moves, positions grow, everything looks profitable on the surface. But unless you control who you trade with, how much you allow them to trade, and what protection you take, you are just throwing a very expensive party, right? So we'll take a example of Dia here. So meet Dia, the credit risk manager at Aurora Commodities we discussed in the first slide. Her job is not to chase profit, right? Her job is to make sure profits are real, right? Meaning that they actually turn into cash, right? So in this analogy, The house party is the trading relationship, right? The guests are counterparties. The drinks and food are open position and market exposure. At the bill, and the bill at the end is settlement. So house party is trading relationship, guests are counterparties, drinks and food are open position and market exposure, and the bill at the end is settlement. So Dia's role is to ensure no one walks out unpaid, right? But if she doesn't wait until the party ends, that is the key difference between amateurs and professional, right? So Dia's goal is simple: prevent value loss before it happens, not recover losses after the fact, right? So not argue with the counterparties later, not rely on the legal teams month down on the line, right? So don't talk to legal teams after a few months that you didn't pay, not like that. So the Dia's purpose is prevention, and in real time and every day, right? So this is where Endur or any ETRM steps as the control room, right? So it acts as a central nervous system of credit management, right? So it continuously monitors exposure and market moves, aggregate risks across trades, right? And it checks limits, evaluates collateral, what counterparty has provided, and enforces margin requirements. So all before problem become visible to the business. So while traders are focused on price, DI is focused on payment certainty, right? Because in the real world of commodities trading, a profitable trade that doesn't settle is not a profit, it's a loss waiting to happen, right? So this slide set the foundation. From here onward, we stop talking in metaphors and start breaking down how Endur quantifies exposure, how limits are enforced, and how risk is reduced step by step, right? So let's move forward and see what exposure really means inside ETRM or Endur. Let's move to slide 3. So in this slide, you can see the complete view of risk requires tracking, right? So there are 3 distinct types of exposure you can see in this here. So let's start with this. So every trading disaster has one thing in common. Someone was looking at partial risk, and while the market was creating total risk, right? So this is why Dia never asks a simple question like how much are we exposed. Instead, she asks what exactly make up our exposure right now, right? So at the start of the day, Dia opens the exposure dashboard in Endur or any ETRM before any action is taken, right? She needs a complete decomposed view of risk, right? And ETRM system breaks exposure into 3 distinct components, right? So the first is mark to market exposure, right? Or MTM we call it generally. So this is the current value of open positions. So based on the live market prices, if market moves this second and the counterparty defaulted, this is the immediate gain or loss Aurora Commodities would face, right? In our example, MTM exposure is $5.2 million. So this number moves constantly with prices, volatility, and time. The second is accrual exposure, right? So this represents value that is already been earned but not received, right? So think of this as money you owed for delivery period that have passed but have not been invoiced or settled. In this case, that is $1.5 million, right? So this is not a speculative. This is this is not a speculative, but it is also not in the bank yet, right? And third is settlement exposure, right? So this is the most dangerous one psychologically because it feels done. Settlement exposure is a cash that should have been paid but has not been, right? So unpaid invoices like due cases. So here is $300,000. So now here is the key insight. Individually, these numbers don't look alarming, right? But Endur doesn't manage them in isolation. It aggregates them. So total exposure will be MTM plus accrual plus settlement, which brings Aurora's total exposure to $7 million, right? So this is the number that matters. Why? Because counterparty default doesn't care whether exposure came from MTM, accruals, or settlement. If the counterparty fails, all of it as at risk, right? This is why ETRM real power is aggregation. It pulls exposure across products, across time buckets, across payment stages, across legal entities, and present one consolidated truth, right? So in our example, Dia now knows exactly where she stands. So before limits, before collateral, before margin. So number is the starting point for every control decision. So in the next slide, we'll talk about how this exposure is legally constrained using entities, master agreements, and credit limits. Because exposure without rules is just hope, right? So let's move to slide 4. So this slide is about establishing the rules of engagement through entities and master agreements, right? So before a single trade is executed, before exposure is measured, before collateral is even discussed, rule must be defined, right? Because in credit risk, who you are trading with legally matters more than who you think you are trading with, right? So Diaz knows this well. So before Green Gas Limited is allowed to trade, right? So our counterparty is Green Gas Limited. So before Green Gas Limited is allowed to trade, she starts with entity structure, right? Not the brand name, not the trading desk, but the legal entities behind the trades. So at the top we have Counterparty Group Green Gas Limited. But beneath that, the group sits multiple legal entities, right? So you can see Green Gas Trading UK and you can see Green Gas Supply Europe. Each one is legally distinct. And the distinction is everything. Why? Because if one entity defaults, contracts signed by another entity may offer zero protection, right? So credit risk lives in legal reality, not organizational charts. This is where master agreements come into the play, right? For each legal entity, DI ensures that an ISDA master agreement is in place. So what is ISDA master agreement? So ISDA master agreement is the most common standardized document used globally for OTC derivatives transaction, published by International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISDA. So it's a framework for managing legal, credit, and operational risks across multiple trades using the single agreement concept for netting, right? So this is ISDA master agreement. So for each legal entity, DIA will ensure that a ISDA master agreement is in place and a credit support annexure or CSA attached, right? So what is credit support annex? So credit support annex is a legal document under the same ISDA master agreement that defines the term for collateral posting to mitigate counterparty credit risk in over-the-counter derivatives. So it determines how much collateral, like either cash or securities, any types of instrument securities, the party must exchange based on the valuation of their derivative position, right? So how much you have provided the collateral because you have taken the derivatives position, right? So this is a legal document under ISDA master agreement, right? So these two agreements must be attached. So these documents define how exposure is calculated, whether netting is allowed, what collateral is acceptable, and how margin calls are enforced, right? So without them, Endur cannot protect you, right? So once the legal framework is mapped, DIA sets the credit limit, right? So in this case, $10 million, for example, right? This is the hard ceiling, not a guideline, not a suggestion, a line the system must not cross, right? So based on all these things, the documents provided, right, and everything in the agreement, DIA sets the credit limit to $10 million. But DIA doesn't rely on the limits alone, right? She configures time-based tolerance, right? What is time-based tolerance? Time-based tolerance act as a early warning buffers, right? Giving the business time to react before a breach becomes critical, right? So now our system, ETRM Endur or any other system, knows who the counterparty is, which legal entities are involved, what agreements govern them, how much exposure is allowed, and how breach will be handled. At this point, risk is no longer abstract. It's measurable, right? It's enforceable and legally grounded, right? So in the next slide, we'll see what happens when market volatility pushes exposure toward those limits, right? And how Endur raises alarm before damage occurs. Because limits don't fail, people fail to watch them, right? So let's move to slide 5. So the slide 5 is titled Volatility Triggers Real-Time Alerts When Tolerance is Breached, right? So market don't move politely, right? We all know, right? They jump, they gap up, they gap down, and sometimes they run away before human can react, right? So one morning market volatility strikes. Gas prices surge unexpectedly, right? Green gas limited open position, a spike in value, right? On paper this looks like profit, right? But for DI it's a credit risk event, because rising prices don't just increase gains, they increase exposure, right? You getting my point? So for example, you have taken position of 1 million and gas prices has increased 25%, your exposure will become 1.25 million, right? So inside Endur, exposure begins to climb, not slowly, not gradually, but fast enough to approach predefined thresholds. So this is where tolerance matters. So remember, limits are hard walls, tolerance are early warning zones, and our ETRM is watching both continuously. So as exposure crosses the tolerance threshold, Endur triggers a real-time alert. Not tomorrow, not end of the day, immediately, right? So the alert doesn't say panic, it says exposure has exceeded tolerance band, an action is required. So you can see that in the image, it says green gas limited exposure has exceeded tolerance band, action required. So this is critical because DIA now has time to access the cows, check collateral coverage, prepare margin calls, or reduce trading activity, all before a limit breach occurs. So look at the chart on the slide. Exposure is rising over time. The tolerance line is crossed first, right? You can see the dotted line is tolerance threshold, right? The hard limit sits above it untouched, right? This gaps is where good risk management lives, right? Why this is important? Because once a limit is breached, options disappear, right? Trades may be blocked, right? Because once you cross the limit of $10 million, you may not be able to trade. The counterparty may not able to trade. Trades may be blocked, position may be forced close, right? Relationship get damaged, right? So that is a huge loss for both parties. But tolerance breaches are control moments, right? So they allow firms to act proactively, not react defensively. So this is why professionals don't manage credit risk with spreadsheets. They use systems like ETRM systems like Endur, Allegro, or any other systems that think in the real time, not hindsight, right? So DIA receives the alert, she doesn't panic, she moves to the next control layer, which is netting. Because raw exposure numbers rarely tell the full story, because you might have multiple positions and after netting the exposure can be different, right? So that we'll talk about in slide 6. Let's move to slide 6. So here, when DIA sees exposure rising, her first question is not how big is the risk, it's how much of this really matters, right? Because raw exposure numbers are gross. They don't yet consider something critical like offsetting position, right? So think of this as you owe a friend $10,000 or rupees. The same friend owes you 8,000, right? So do you really have two obligations? No. What matters is net 2,000, right? 2,000 rupees or dollars. So this is exactly what netting does, right? It recognizes that buys and sell, right? Payables and receivers, positive and negative MTM, and can offset each other if the legal agreement allows it, right? And that if is everything. Netting is not a mathematical choice, it's a legal right, right? Right? Without a valid master agreement, that's why we talked on slide 4, right? Which we created agreements and all, right? So without a valid master agreement, netting simply cannot be applied. So that is really important. So inside Endur or any ETRM, DIA enables netting rules under the CSA, right? So now this system begins to group trades under the same agreement, offset positive and negative MTM, recalculate exposure on net basis. So look at what happens in the image, right? Gross exposure looked alarming, which is like 12 million. But once netting is applied, exposure drops significantly, right? Not because risk vanished, but because risk was measured correctly. So this is the difference between headline risk and economic risk. So professional care more about the second. But here is the catch. Netting only works up to a point. If markets keep moving in one direction, offset disappear and exposure begins climbing again. So which means netting is necessary but not sufficient, right? So DIA knows this. So once net exposure is calculated, she moves to the next line of defense, right? So next line of defense is what? Collateral. Because when exposure cannot be netted away, it must be secured, right? So in the next slide, say slide 7, we'll see how does collateral acts as a physical security deposit against residual risk. Okay, let's move to slide 7. So up to this point, everything we have discussed lives in numbers. Exposure, limits, netting, important, but still abstract. So collateral is where credit risk becomes real, because collateral is not a promise. It's something you already hold, right? So think of collateral like a security deposit. If you rent an apartment, the landlord doesn't trust your future income alone. They ask for cash upfront, not because they expect trouble, but because things can go wrong, right? You may lose job, right? Or you didn't make the house as maintained as it was earlier, right? So that's exactly how collateral works in trading, right? So when net exposure remains high, DIA doesn't argue with markets, right? See, ask a simple question. What do we already hold against the risk? So in ETRM, collateral comes in many forms, right? Cash, you can put cash as a collateral, government bonds, letter of credit, eligible securities, anything. But not everything is equal. So each asset has eligibility rules, right? Haircuts, we'll talk about that. Valuation frequencies, all defined inside the credit support annex that we talked earlier in slide 4, I guess. In our scenario, Green Gas Limited already posted collateral. So Endur will automatically values that collateral, applies agreed haircuts, and offset it against net exposure, right? So look at what happens. So net exposure goes down again, not because market moved, but because protection exists, right? So this is a secured risk, right? This is the key mindset shift. DIA is not trying to eliminate exposure. That is impossible in trading. So it's trying to ensure that every unit of exposure is backed by a value. And Endur enforces this discipline relentlessly. If collateral becomes insufficient, the system doesn't wait for excuses. It prepares the next steps. Now the second thing is margining, right? So because when exposure moves faster than collateral, margin calls must follow, right? So in the next slide, we'll see how Endur calculates margin requirements and triggers margin calls automatically before risk become loss. So let's move to slide 8. Okay, so markets never wait for paperwork, right? So prices move first, risk follows immediately. And margining is how Endur keeps protection in lockstep with exposure. So after netting and collateral, they reviews the updated numbers, right? So exposure is covered, but only for now, because volatility doesn't pause. So this is where margining rules take over. Margining answers one critical question. How much additional protection do we need today? So inside Endur, margin is calculated by comparing net exposure minus eligible collateral already held, right, against threshold defined in the CSA, right, the contract. So if exposure exceeds, right, what covered, a margin requirement is created automatically, right? So let's break this down. So every CSA defined threshold, how much unsecured exposure is allowed, then minimum transfer amount to avoid tiny margin calls, and then margin call frequency, like either you do daily or intraday. So Endur respect all of it. No discretion, no negotiation, just rules. In our case, market prices keep rising. So net exposure pushes past the unsecured threshold. So Endur responds instantly. A margin call is generated because the exposure now exceeds the letter of credit. Not because they have pressed a button, not because the system is designed to act before human debate. The margin call specifies required amount, eligible collateral type, valuation date, settlement timeline. This is operational precision. So margining is not about distrust, it's about survivability. Because if exposure is allowed to grow uncovered, losses become structural, not accidental. So there now has two outcomes. The counterparty post margin, risk stays controlled, or they fail to post, risk escalates. Either way, clarity replaces uncertainty, right? So in the next slide, we'll see how Endur track margin disputes, failures and accelerations, and how unresolved margin could turn into serious credit events. So let's move to slide 9. Okay, the crisis has passed, market has stabilized, margin calls were issued, collateral was posted, Aurora is safe. But in professional risk management, resolution is not the end of story, right? Because what is not reported might as well has never happened, right? So it's month end, and Dia is no longer talking to systems, he is talking to people, right? So she walks into the risk committee meeting and with one responsibility: explain the firm's risk posture clearly, confidently, and defensively, right? So this is where Endur reporting layer become critical. Not operational dashboard, not trader views, but management and regulatory grade reporting, right? So on the screen we have a risk heat map, right? So at a glance it feels like powerful story. Each counterparty is evaluated across 3 dimensions: total exposure, collateral held, and risk rating. So company A is medium risk, right? Company B is high risk, right? And Green Gas Limited, low risk, stable. Not because exposure is small, but because exposure is properly covered. So that distinctions matter, right? This is what senior management cares about, not raw MTM numbers, but answers to questions like where are we vulnerable, right? Who needs acceleration? And are controls working as designed? On the right side, we see key Endur reports, right? Exposure report, collateral balances, margin, call outstanding, right? So these are not optional. These are operationally and regulatorily essential. So exposure reports is real time and historical, right? And collateral balances, what we hold, where and in what form. So that is collateral balances. Outstanding margin calls that include disputes and delays, right? Then limit breaches and exceptions, that is fully auditable. So every number is time stamped, traceable and reproducible, which means when auditors ask questions, the system already has answers, right? So this is the final maturity point of credit risk management. Not firefighting, no intuition, but governed, explainable and auditable control. In the next slide, we'll close the section by trying everything together, right? And understanding why mastering credit, collateral and margining is not optional but essential for business continuity, right? So let's move to slide 10. So before we close the section, let's slow down and anchor the language, because credit risk failures often happen not due to bad intent but due to misunderstood concepts. So Endur is a precise system, and precision starts with shared definitions. So exposure, what is exposure? Exposure is simply money at risk with a counterparty, right? So just like lending at a party, let we talk in the start as a metaphor. Think of it as lending money at the party. So if the guest leaves early, this is what you may never recover. So in Endur, exposure is not guessed, it is calculated continuously. Second thing is limits. Limits define the maximum exposure you are willing to tolerate. This is your credit card limit example, right? For example, you have 10 lakh rupees credit card limit, right? That is the maximum exposure you are willing to tolerate. It doesn't care how confident you feel. Once crossed, spending stops. So limit exists to protect the firm from overconfidence and momentum. That is limits. Collateral. Collateral is security against credit risk. So collateral is security held against credit risk. This is your security deposit. It converts trust into tangible protection. If things go wrong, collateral absorbs the shock, right? Just like you pay a deposit to the landlord at the time of getting a apartment for rent. Then there is margin. Margin represents incremental protection as market moves. So this is top up money, not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly, as long as exposure keeps changing. And if it crosses above your collateral, you'll get a margin call, right? And the last not on the list we are talking here is netting. Netting means reducing exposure by offsetting trades. So if you have long position and short position, you can just combine things and create a combined exposure. But that only works when legally permitted, which is why agreements matter, right? That we discussed. So these 5 concepts form a single control loop, not separate ideas. A system. So exposure create risk, limit contain it, netting compress it, collateral secures it, and margin keep it current. So if any one of these breaks, the entire structure weakens. But when all work together, as they do in ETRM applications, credit risk become manageable, measurable, and survivable, right? So in the final slide, we'll step back and answer the big question. Why does all of this matter for a business as a whole, right? So let's move to slide 11. So at the end of the day, credit risk management is not about models. It's not about system. It's not about compliance. It's about survival, right? So every major trading failure in the history followed the same pattern. Exposure grew quietly, controls lagged behind markets, protection arrived too late, not because people were careless, not because systems were incomplete. This is why mastering credit, collateral, and margining is not optional. It's foundational, right? So let's look at what this mastery delivers, right? So protection is the first thing. So credit control protect the firm from catastrophic losses caused by counterparty default, right? They ensure that when something breaks, it breaks within tolerable limits. The second thing is compliance. So modern trading firms operate under intense scrutiny, right? So Endur or any other ETRM provides auditable controls, regulatory reports, defensible decision trails. So compliance is no longer reactive, it's built in, right? And the third is continuity. Continuity is good risk management doesn't block business, it enables it by controlling exposure intelligently. So firm can trade confidently, maintain relationships, avoid unnecessary shutdown. This is how trading continues, even during volatility, right? And the last but not least is automation. So finally, automation is the real differentiator. So we should not have any manual checks, spreadsheet, or late night reconciliation. It enforces discipline in real time. So if you are building or using any ETRM application like Endur, so your application doesn't rely on manual checks, spreadsheet, or late night reconciliation. It enforces discipline in real time, like margin call, collateral adjustment, limit checks, all automatic, all precise. This is what professional credit risk management looks like. No fear, no guesswork, but structured control. So Aurora Commodities survives, not because markets were kind, but because systems were prepared, right? So this concludes our section credit collateral and margining in Endur. Right. Thank you very much for joining this session. We'll in the next session we'll talk about section 9. Section 9 is more about post-trade operations, settlements and accounting, which covers chapter 321 to 365 of our extended ETRM training program. And in section 10 we'll talk about logistic nomination and physical operation, which covers 366 to 410 chapters. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good day.